Great. Well, welcome everyone. Uh, Thanks for being with us today. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm very excited to be with you and hope you're all doing well and staying healthy. We have close to 200 people registered for this event, so really excited about that. I'm also very excited that this is the first joint event between AFERM and the FAIR Institute, and I hope this collaboration will provide great value for both of our members. I'll talk a little bit about AFERM, just briefly, and I'm sure Nick will say a few words about the FAIR Institute. AFERM is a professional organization dedicated to the advancement of ERM in the federal government, and you can learn a lot more about AFERM at AFERM.org. I'm Thomas Holland. I'm the secretary of AFERM. I was the programs committee chair for years, so hosting events to bring relevant content to the federal ERM community is near and dear to my heart. I can't take any credit for today's event. That goes, of course, to Nick, but also to Varun Malhotra, who is currently the AFERM programs chair. Varun was supposed to be opening this event instead of me, but his wife actually had a baby this week. So we're very excited for Varun, and we look forward to the other events that he's been working on for AFERM. So to that point, those of you who have been involved with AFERM for a while know that it is incredibly important for us to deliver events that are useful for the community and have an educational component. The board really wanted to make sure we did not lose that as we now switch to a much more virtual environment. So as such, our annual summit training that many of you may be familiar with will be delivered virtually this year. And Varun has also been spearheading for AFERM developing and delivering more virtual events. So after today's event, our next event will be next Wednesday, and it'll be co-hosted with the IBM Center for the Business of Government, and the topic is risk management in the AI era. So I hope you can join us for that as well. And our big annual ERM Summit training, which I mentioned, is being held September 10th. So definitely make sure to register for that soon to get the early bird special. It's always a lot of fantastic content and really a great deal in terms of price, especially this year. So please check that out. So like I said, for more info about AFERM and to register for any of the events, please visit AFERM.org. And also feel free to email programs@AFERM.org with any ideas for future events. So I'm very excited for today's topic and speaker, as I mentioned. So we have with us Nick Sanna, who is the president of the FAIR Institute and the CEO of RiskLens. In his role as president of the FAIR Institute, Nick works to help risk officers and CISOs get a seat at the business table by leveraging the FAIR standard. Nick's passion is to help the industry close the gap that separates IT from the business. Thank you, Nick, for being with us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I'm really pleased about the opportunity to address AFERM members and to start a relationship, a partnership between our two organizations. A quick word about the FAIR Institute. We started the FAIR Institute on the demand, based on the demand of many large organizations and government institutions that wanted to learn about better ways of doing risk management. And on the heels of the emergence of a new standard called FAIR that helps quantify risk in financial terms, especially various forms of operational risk and specifically cybersecurity risk. And so the FAIR Institute has been incorporated as a non-profit expert organization with its mission to advance the risk management profession based on the principles brought about by the FAIR standard. The FAIR standard being a standard taxonomy and risk analytics model that helps articulate risk again in financial terms. Its main mission of the Institute is threefold. One is educating its members to the benefits and principles of the FAIR standard. Number two is sharing of best practices as organizations adopt FAIR to build their risk management programs. We want them to share best practices and accelerate the advancement of the profession. And third, networking. As people develop expertise, be also matchmakers between people that develop this expertise and people that are looking for expertise, and also tie them to solution providers that may have some tools or services or training in the process. So with that, that's in terms of a brief introduction of what we do. The organization now has grown to close to 9,000 members worldwide. We have about 30 local chapters. We also have an annual conference. This year is going to be held in October 6th and 7th virtually, and so online for the first time because of COVID, and plenty of resources to learn about the topic. And so I'll point them out at the end of the session. With that, I want to introduce the topic. And so the topic that AFERM and the FAIR Institute came up for today's session is how financial risk quantification can help federal agencies better integrate cybersecurity risk and enterprise risk management. And so since we're speaking at AFERM, I just want to introduce this by saying that cybersecurity, integrating cyber into ERM, has become a topic that is of prominence in many organizations, and something that many organizations tell us they struggle to put together these two worlds, cyber and ERM. They've been separate organizations. Cyber more focused on technical delivery, on technical tools, and less focused on risk. And ERM focused on more operational risks. And how do we tie these two worlds together? And so we're going to talk about that today, coming at it from the cybersecurity risk angle. And moving forward here, the first concept I want to talk about, and again, I will go through the slides, but also feel free to interrupt with questions in the questions box as we go. I'll try my best to answer them on the flow. Otherwise, if I miss them, happy to also field questions at the end. I think we have plenty of time for that. The main thing, the main concept I want to start with is that expectations for people who have been responsible traditionally for cybersecurity have changed. Initially, when the internet came about and the first threats emerged and losses, I think people responsible for cybersecurity became very quickly adept about painting the scenarios in which bad things could happen, and use those discussions as ways to fund those initiatives and get support, for this initiative. And so fear, uncertainty, and doubt became a good tool, an effective tool to getting the attention of the business and funding initiatives, mostly technical in nature to begin with. We then transitioned over the years to, a set of best practices that started emerging. And so compliance checklist came about. For those who are more familiar with cyber, you may remember the SANS 20. If you fix these 20 vulnerabilities, you're going to be secure, only to discover, a while later that you still got breached because new threats were emerging, and a rigid compliance checklist was not sufficient. Where we are mostly in the marketplace to evaluate cyber risk is mostly around, more technical maturity models, set of best practices. And we could even count, the NIST cybersecurity framework among those that tells you how well are we scoring against those set of best practices that are mostly technical in nature. But we're seeing an evolution in the marketplace as people start, reporting against those maturity models and rating themselves against. We see a shift in the questions that are coming and opposed to cybersecurity, oftentimes coming from the risk side. And these questions are more economical in nature. They're coming from the risk side, from the regulators. They're coming from the executives. They're really more economical in nature. And what we mean by that is it takes the form of questions like the ones you see on the screen. We see more and more people responsible for cybersecurity being asked questions such as, how much risk does the agency have? Are we spending too much or too little on risk mitigation, especially as we move everything to the cloud? Are we doing enough or not? There's always this very difficult dialogue that when people audit your activities, especially against a standard like the NIST CSF or some FISMA metrics, they basically asking, by how much do the implementation of these best practices reduce risk, and which one is most effective in our context? And there's other people asking also, what are my top risks, and how you're prioritizing all the numbers, the dozens of things you need to do to mitigate risk in our organization. And then we have other questions that are very directly economical in nature that's saying, are we spending the budget on the right things and what's the ROI? And we have the CIOs and CISOs who are responsible for cybersecurity in government. I'm here, I don't want to offend anybody. I'm having them speak Greek only to say that as a profession, the industry taught these profiles to speak in terms of threats and vulnerabilities. And so in terms of state of controls of threats, but not responding in tone to those questions. And so there is a big communication challenge, a disconnect where people talk a little bit past one another and we haven't bridged that gap yet. And so, and then we're gonna discuss about how to bridge the gap in this discussion. And in government, the government has made big steps in terms of setting expectations for, especially when it comes to cyber, and setting requirements for measuring and assessing and then reporting on cyber risk. FISMA has set the foundation, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, and all the related guidances by OMB and Department of Homeland Security makes explicit reference to risk-based strategies for management of cybersecurity. And when it comes to clarifying these objectives, the executive order by the Trump administration went even further. And not only says you need to have a risk-based approach, but it holds the agency heads directly responsible for implementing risk management measures that are commensurate with the risk each agency faces, and then being cost-effective in the process. So are you implementing the right measures in the face of risk? And then are you being, a good steward of the resources? And are you, let's make sure you don't overspend or underspend, and put potentially, the public or agency operations at risk. And this is even further reinforced by the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the special publication at 137 and 39 that basically set a standard best practice for managing cybersecurity risk, and that very directly also point to the need for conducting risk assessments in the realm of cybersecurity, like any other form of risk in those agencies. And those special publications also help, directly map the risk management framework that an agency will have to adopt with the cybersecurity framework. And then OMB also issued a circular that says that cybersecurity risk should not be assessed in isolation. It should become part of the fabric of how we assess risk as part of an integrated, enterprise risk management program, so that cyber can be seen as part of the wider set of risks and prioritized for action accordingly. And so when people say the government, is not ready to embrace risk management, at least I can say the foundation from the expectation setting has been set. What we have seen agencies struggle with is responding to these expectations. And how do they move from what they were used to, a set of technical cybersecurity requirements, and now speaking the risk language? And that's a challenge that most agencies face today. So what is being done today is that when it comes to risk assessment, is we see a couple of practices. They may not be, comprehensive in my description. I'm going to oversimplify here potentially, but what we see for the most part is doing assessment using checklist, going down the list of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework requirement, 104 requirements, activities, and rating myself against it, or going down the FISMA metrics and seeing how well we are, abiding, and meeting them. If we need attention in some areas more than others, more of a technical approach, but also more very subjective, because, if you need to rank myself on a scale 1 to 4, it's not very scientific, and it has mostly based on technical consideration. When people are actually attempting to manage risk, not just measure yourself against a set of technical best practice, we see a lot of color codes, red, yellow, green, high, medium, lows, and scales 1 to 4, 1 to 5, are used as a way to assess risk. And while directionally they can really separate big risk from lower risk, they do nothing to respond to those questions we saw before, like how much risk does a 2 represent or a red represent, I was speaking with a congressman the other day, and he was telling me, I got this report from Homeland Security, there's a red dot. And I asked them, what does that red dot mean? And they didn't know how to answer. So I need an answer for that, because we're giving money, taxpayer money, to fund initiatives supposed to reduce cyber risk. And we cannot even answer this simple question about how much risk is red or how much risk is 3. And if I invest this amount of money to mitigate risk, what does it buy me in terms of risk reduction? And so, unfortunately, we're facing, in terms of traditional approaches, not just a problem of a very disparate set of definition of risk, and so no consistency in how risk is measured in cyber, but also then very subjective and qualitative measurements of risk, and don't do much to managing risk from the resource perspective and from the prioritization perspective. And I'm going to ground this in the context. I'm going to just pick on the NIST cybersecurity framework, but I could have picked, also a checklist according to FISMA similarly. But when on the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see how our function in the cybersecurity framework in a category is broken down in subcategories, and how people try to rate themselves according to the tiering system that's proposed by NIST, and rate themselves based on the judgment of the person is evaluating that readiness. And but then once you do that, the same questions keep coming around. I here listed 3 that organizations in government tell me they get all the time. How do we prioritize where to focus when there are multiple NIST areas that are lower than our targets? Target may be a tier 4. We have a bunch of subcategories that are at tier 2. Which of the tier 2s there are, where we have a gap from our target should we prioritize? And they say they don't know. The best answer usually they get is like experience. We've been around the block for a while, and we're using our judgment to make a call, and that's the best we can get to. Another type of question we're hearing is that, spending, a certain amount of money, in this case, arbitrary $2 million number, a good business case to move it from 2 to a 4. Is it too much? Is it too little? They don't know what to say about that because this tiering system doesn't help answer that question. And so again, these tiering systems are okay to show directionally where we are, but again, don't do much in terms of telling us how to prioritize, especially from the resource allocation perspective. And so this leads us to probably pausing for a moment and discuss about what the goal of a risk management should be, especially what should an effective risk management program allow me to do. And we want to define an effective risk management program as a management program that allows me to achieve an acceptable level of risk cost effectively. And so what are the set of activities, processes, and tooling that allows me to achieve that level of risk that I can live with in a way that doesn't break the bank and the budget? And so having said that, you achieve that level of effectiveness like anything in life, and achieve and make cost-effective decisions when you can make comparisons among multiple options. In cybersecurity, like in many domains, you can solve the problem in potentially many different ways. And these different ways may have different relative effectiveness in terms of risk reduction, but may also have different level of cost. And so being able to understand the trade-offs of various approaches, whether it's implementing some tools, hiring X number of people, improving my process, which combination of these gives me the good trade-offs is key to running an effective risk management program. But to do that, to achieve these effective comparisons, you need to have good and meaningful measurements. And this is where a model like FAIR, that we are going to talk about today, comes into play, can be really, really helpful. And so the model called FAIR, Factor Analysis of Information Risk, is a standard, model that allows you to do a few things. It is, first of all, a standard taxonomy. And this is important because in many organizations in government, there is no standard definition of risk, And so in the absence of standard definition of risk, we see when there is a risk register, a lot of very disparate, definitions of risk scenarios. In some cases, they sound like a threat. In some cases, what is described is not really a risk, it's a control deficiency. In some cases, what's described is a resulting loss or a breakdown in a process, but not really a risk as defined by a standard like FAIR, where you can describe the loss events, starting from the threat, affecting an asset of value and resulting in material business, impact to the operation or the agency. And only when you have a probable loss event, you have risk according to the FAIR standard. And so that's very useful, because if you can use this model to scope what a risk scenario is, it allows people in risk management, especially on the cyber risk side, to speak the same language and make sure that we understand the components that make up risk and don't confuse, a factor of risk with risk itself. And that's very important, because the number one failure we see in many cyber risk management programs, and for that matter also in risk management, is that if we don't have common definition of risk, we risk populating a risk register where the majority of the entries at the end are not risks. They may be issues, concerns, scary things, but not risk defined as probable loss events that have these components consistently defined. And so that's the number one value that a standard like that FAIR brings to you, is a consistent way to define risk. It starts from there. That's where you can put your program on rails by using the same language, same definitions, or you can go downhill where everybody can make up what risk is, and then get in trouble very quickly. And instead of having a risk register, you may just have a dumping ground that you should call probably like an issue register. The second thing that the FAIR standard brings about is that it's a analytics model. I'm going to spend more time on this in the next slide, where it decomposes risk into factors to the point where they can be measured and quantified, so that risk then can be communicated in financial terms and be better managed. Because you can unless you can measure something and communicate it effectively, it's very difficult to manage these assets or these operations effectively. And so, spending a few more words on FAIR as an analytics model, this is where FAIR is really powerful. FAIR decomposes risk into discrete factors. You can see here, again, in the context of a loss event. If you have a loss event defined, now let's assess how much risk we have in this scenario. And you can see here two main branches, loss event frequency on the top and loss magnitude. In common terms in the industry, people think likelihood and impact, so it's equivalent to that. And so at this high level of definition, people agree that that's an acceptable definition of risk. And except here, the terminology matters, because what FAIR is good about is make sure that you rely on discrete measurements and not just ambiguous measurements to define each of these factors. And you can see loss event frequency can be broken down further down into more discrete factors. And loss event frequency is a factor of threat event frequency. How many times can a threat actor attempt to inflict harm on this organization, or an operator that's non-trained maybe make a mistake. That against the vulnerability, which is what is the probability of this threat event turning into a loss event, that can be further broken down into what are the capabilities of threat actor and what's the resistance of my controls, who's likely to win. So the comparison between the strength of the threat actor and the resistance of control gives me a percentage that basically describes the vulnerability of my system to a certain amount of threat activity. On the threat event frequency side, that can be broken down further as well. If you don't have good data in a FAIR model, you can always go down lower in the level of abstraction. You can derive to those amounts by looking deeper into the model. In the case of threat event frequency, if you don't have good data, you can basically derive it from looking at what is the contact frequency of these threat actors to this network, to this asset, and what's the probability of action in the context that we operate in. And when you look at these two things in context, you can derive threat event frequency. And so, depending on the availability of data, where you have a lot of data, historical data at the top, you can stay at that level. Or if you don't have a lot of data, or you're looking at future scenarios, you can drill down and apply critical thinking. And this is a model that guides you, to think critically to the factors that make up risk. And so we just covered briefly, what comes into play for defining loss event frequency. On the right-hand side, we're defining the impact or the loss magnitude in FAIR parlance. And the FAIR standard does a good job in separating, not only the forms of loss and the impact that occurs right away when an event happens, when an incident hits. And here we're talking about primary losses, things like loss of productivity. System is down. Maybe the cloud is down and we cannot operate. I have a bunch of people idle, cannot do their work. Or drive immediate replacement costs. Some assets have been compromised. We need to replace them and stand up different assets. Or response costs. You got to respond to an incident, and now there are a vast amount of people responding to the incident to get us up and running or to stop the attack from reaching. And so it accounts not only for these primary losses, but also for the cascading effect. In a subset of the events, you may have a fallout. That's what we call secondary risk. It may have its own frequency because it may not happen every time. Oftentimes for internal incidents, they don't have repercussions on secondary stakeholder, external stakeholders. There may not be fallout. But in the case of, incidents that touch secondary stakeholders, let's say the public, let's say a breach where the personal identity of taxpayers is, or of employees of this agency are now breached and are now in the open, you may have cascading effects in many forms. This can take many forms, such as privacy liability, various forms of reputational loss, fines and judgment, and all of these can be quantified. Oftentimes we hear the questions like, yeah, but how do you quantify reputational loss? How do you do this on response costs? In government, we don't measure those things, and it's fascinating when you apply this critical thinking in the context of an agency. Suddenly you realize that an incident happens. And when we talk about responding and also reputational loss, how to respond to these things, there may be facets that people didn't measure before, but such as, okay, we got a breach, and suddenly we had lawyers involved, and we had to spend a lot of money. We had our agency had to go to Congress and to the White House multiple times to explain himself and what we're doing about it to make sure it doesn't repeat itself and why did it happen in the first place. Many meetings, a lot of people involved. Guess what? All those things cost money. And so even in contexts like government, where we may not be used to measuring impact of certain events, like maybe, private companies would do, once you apply critical thinking to it, you start to realize that activities happen and they actually typically cost money or at least a level of effort. And so this model is very, proven to be very effective in measuring risk, not just because we, the FAIR Institute, say so, but it is an international standard by the Open Group, which is a standard global consortium headquartered in San Francisco that is sponsored by 800 organizations, including government organizations and universities and major Fortune companies. And what the Institute does, the Open Group does, is it searches, new ways to solving, problems in the industry. And when it came to assessing information of cyber risk, they scanned the market for possible solutions and models and identified FAIR and evaluated against other models and settled it as the best way to not only define but also assess cyber risk. One thing I want to say, since we're talking to AFERM members, there's nothing in this picture that limits the application of this model to any form of risk. So we are here speaking about how to integrate cyber risk in ERM, but if we assess cyber risk using this model, we could use FAIR to assess other forms of operational risk, whether it's physical security, whether it's a breakdown in process, whether it's fraud. So I want to make sure that it's clear that this is not just limited to cyber. The FAIR model expands to all forms of operational risk, and so which in many cases allows to have this lingua franca, this common language across the various risk discipline in an agency. We already spoke about it briefly, but I want to highlight that FAIR is complementary. It's not overlapping what you may think as risk management frameworks. All the risk management frameworks, and here I listed 3 of them. ISO 27000 theories, or 31,000 since we're speaking about to operational risk professionals, the NIST Cybersecurity framework, and COSO as a framework is used in ERM, especially in the private sector. they all outline how risk management process should look like. You shall identify risk, you shall assess risk, you shall, then do something about treat it, report on it, and close this loop on an ongoing basis. But they don't tell you how to define risk. So what's the taxonomy you want to use? Well, they don't tell you how to assess risk. What's the model you're going to use? And so FAIR is really the substantiation of how you're going to define risk and assess risk and then report on risk that those frameworks really tell you to do. So very complementary, to the point that NIST references FAIR formally now on its website, and COSO references it directly as well as a valid model for assessing risk. We talked about the wide number of members at the FAIR Institute. Since we're talking to the government audience, there's a vibrant FAIR government chapter at the FAIR Institute that dwells into how to apply FAIR in a government setting, including how to quantify things that are hard to quantify in federal government. So I invite you to look into it and to become a member. A membership is free, by the way, and get engaged and learn how to apply this in your own realities. And the other last comment I want to make on this slide is it is an open approach. It's an open standard. There's nothing mysterious about it. The principles of FAIR have been well documented in a book called Measuring and Managing Information Risk, and it's seen as a reference in the industry. And so the book and many resources in the FAIR Institute allow you to learn about how to apply this in real life, even when you have little data or used to measuring, like in many cases in the government. So analyze breaking down risk to do what? To articulate risk, as we said before, in ways that agency heads, finance heads in agencies, and people who need to assess the cost effectiveness, of measures can assess. And here you can see sample reports, driven from commercial tools that apply this FAIR model to allow you to answer in tone to questions like how much risk we have. The answer may be like anything in risk, in ranges. People may apply Monte Carlo simulations for these kind of reporting, and to generate this kind of report, and then the output is a range. There's variance with the most likely figure, and you have minimum and maximum, tenths and ninths percentile. Like anything in range is going to look like a bell curve as a result, or in this case, a loss of exceedance curves. And users of FAIR can articulate, what a probability of a certain amount of losses on a continuum. And if you pick a certain percentile, the application of FAIR allows you then to compare risk scenario and see, how, what are my top risks, and what is the exposure in dollars and cents to those scenarios? What's the cost to our agency if those scenarios were to happen, and what's actually on a probabilistic, view on an annual basis? What can the impact be in our context? And then with the right tooling, you can aggregate this risk. And if you look at the top right-hand report in the slide, aggregate and see how we're trending over time as an aggregate, maybe my top 10, top 20 risks. And how does it compare to a risk appetite that we may have, a line of materiality where it's all hands on deck. We want to know about it and do something about it. And tracking ourselves against the risk appetite over time. And then, of course, using this to justify, risk reduction by implementing a series of controls, whether it's process tools or, people, and then identify in what ways do losses materialize in our agency. Is it more privacy liability, where we got a breach and we need to pay a bunch of people, maybe credit monitoring, or response costs, where suddenly it's all hands on deck and we need to involve, expensive firms, outside firms, internal people to respond and stop this attack. And then, of course, evaluating, and this is very useful for decision-making, evaluating what activity, of the many things we could do about it, which combination of these things give me the biggest ROI in terms of risk reduction. Again, I want to pause a second to say you can ask questions in the question box on GoToMeeting as we go, or reserve questions for the end. I will continue now the presentation in the context of the NIST cybersecurity framework, as many agencies are mapping their controls initiative to the cybersecurity framework as the special publications, recommend and actually ask you to do. And so, as agencies map their behavior to managing risk, cyber risk, according to the cybersecurity framework, interesting to note that the cybersecurity framework itself, in the very first paragraphs of the standard, speak about the necessity to overlay the implementation of cybersecurity framework, which is what everybody's doing, implementing controls and measuring yourself in terms of technical, and maturity level in implementation. But they say to be effective and be cost effective and have a real risk-based approach, you need to overlay this implementation, especially on the control side, with real risk management practices, where we can understand how much risk the business, in this case the agency, is willing to undertake in the pursuit of certain objectives. What is the budget we have to play with that is available to achieve those objectives? So we can provide guidance to the operations team to help us achieve the target risk profile, and then iteratively adjust so that we can continuously improve our risk posture. And so what the entire industry is doing is the bottom triangle, focus on controls. What we're not doing enough is that yellow triangle in the top. This is where FAIR really helps. And you can see here how complementary FAIR is to a standard like the cybersecurity framework. And even from the question specific, what kind of questions the two standards, these are two complementary standards, they answer complementary questions. If the NIST cybersecurity framework helps answer questions such as, what is the maturity level of my cybersecurity activities? FAIR helps you answer, more economical questions such as, how much risk do we have in our context, and which of these activities that the NIST TSF suggests matter the most in my context, in our context as an agency, and should be prioritized. And so there are apparently questions. I am not seeing here the questions in my box. Here, let me see if I can figure out a way to expand it. I'm talking to the organizer and I'm not seeing it pop up, and so I'm asking the moderator if you can plug it in the chat box if possible. Okay, there is an X next to the question box. It's not doing the trick. Okay, I will keep going on, and so if the moderator can maybe put the questions in the chat, I will answer as soon as I see them. Okay. And yeah, I would absolutely, because I cannot see the question box anymore. So if you can translate it into the chat, please. Yeah, to the moderator, I have just asking the moderator, telling him that the question box doesn't show any questions in my little panel. So moving forward, and this is important because the NIST TSF is a great set of best practices. It's not too long, not too detailed, great for agencies to make sure they're focused on the right things, but in different contexts, in different agencies, the priority in which certain activities should be implemented can change dramatically and can be vastly different. And so how much you spend on certain control in an agency versus another agency, what you should prioritize can and should vary greatly. And this is where combining FAIR along with a standard like NIST TSF, or if FISMA metrics, the same logic would apply, is very, very important. So moving forward, a few more data points here in terms of NIST referencing FAIR and seeing themselves, more and more aligned. These two standards. One, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework references FAIR formally as an informative reference. And so if you look at informative reference and Google it, you'll find FAIR listed as a valid, assessment model. And more relevant to the discussion we're having today with AFERM members is that there is a new standard called NIST 8286, which has been published in draft mode in, I believe, in April, May, and is undergoing final review that lists FAIR along valid risk analysis methods. And basically the standard says, if you want to integrate cyber with enterprise risk management using a language, the financial language can be a lingua franca, common language to assess the impact of risk, can be a big unifying factor and can greatly aid in decision making, especially when you want to assess the impact of risk scenarios and assess the size of your investments. And so, okay, so what we'll do is that we will, for those who asked questions already, we will pause at the end and allow you to ask questions then, given that the panel is not working for that at this moment. So a few more educational slides to show the logic in which you would actually, how you would do this in real life. And so if you were to apply FAIR to prioritize activity within the CSF, you would identify first the loss event scenarios, the risks that are most relevant to organizations using the taxonomy and probably some quick risk quantification. Then determine which cybersecurity frameworks, subcategories, activities are relevant to those loss scenarios. Perform a cost-benefit analysis, and basically conducting a baseline analysis and then assessing the effect of the control in a future state comparison, and then make a decision based on it. And so a simple illustration of that is here is a report that an agency has generated based on such an analysis, where given this was subcategory where the NIST CSS tells you that to protect your data, you shall basically protect it. And in this case, the agency is trying to implement a certain type of encryption and wanted to assess the effectiveness of investing in this encryption technology to basically mask the data and make sure that it's not accessible by threat actors. And so we did a baseline analysis, and I assume here this was the most likely figure. They can have an annual loss exposure close to 36 million. Then they evaluated the effectiveness of control. In what ways does this control affect the factors of risk? We ran the analysis and see a $32 million reduction. But one thing that also became evident is that for this agency, in the database, there were many records that were of users that were stale, no longer should be in this database because they're no longer, enjoying the service. However, just keeping this data in the database, if there were to be a breach, the agency would still be subject to liability for personal records and credit card numbers if such records were there in the database. And so just purging the data would also reduce risk in an amount. So in this case, the agency can make a decision saying, can we live up, three decisions possibly. Can we live up with the risk? Is this non-material? And so can we live with it and we do nothing? Or should we purge the data and in this analysis made it explicit what exposure is for having the convenience of having all the user data into the system, or implement it as a more expensive solution. This may be costing you multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is it a worth investment to spend $500,000 to or more to have a $32 million risk reduction? So that's the kind of decision this enables, and what it does, it gets you in a risk logic that involves then the real decision makers at the agency level. So you now, as a cybersecurity professional, provided options to the business and the agency decision maker, and saying we can do either three options as a security organization. The onus is not on me to make this call. My job is to provide the options. Now you, the business side, the agency head, the people responsible for the services, finance, help me make this decision, because how much risk the agency should have is your responsibility as part of your risk governance kind of obligations. And so the real discussion changes from begging for money and saying bad things will happen, or I need to have one thing of each in the cyber framework, to basically now saying, here are the options. And we have multiple options to address these things the cybersecurity framework is telling me I should do, and how much we should do about it, and what then becomes a business decision. It really changes the discussion, and it turns into a decision-making process, risk aligned versus just a technical and financial handholding that doesn't connect. Another example in the context of government, a big issue that many agencies have is prioritize, risk mitigation activities, and they call them POADs, and they have a lot of them they need to fix. And usually it's like, we have seen these long spreadsheets with a lot of initiatives, and they need to work them all oftentimes. But since, time and money and resources are limited, how do you prioritize them? And so here's where risk quantification is another example how a quantitative approach to assessing risk helps you in this case assess which of these scenarios in terms of risk reduction helps me prioritize. In this case, I'm prioritizing an initiative that clears, resolves the situation where I was above a level of risk I should tolerate, I want to tolerate, and I'm going to start with that. And so if somebody's auditing me and tells me why you're fixing that before anything else, I can stand my ground and explain the rationale why I'm focusing on the biggest impact, on the biggest risk reduction. So, and in here, the use cases can be infinite. It can be about, what is the risk associated with certain vulnerabilities, to assessing more strategically the risk associated maybe with some move to the cloud. We evaluate different cloud providers that may be FedRAMP certified, but what are the right settings that gives us a satisfactory setting that we can live with, and with different trade-offs for investment. How much bells and whistles do we need really, and so we can make those determinations based on this risk analysis. That's just another example. Or implementing new security measure and seeing, is the investment worth, the effort and investment, and so forth. So as you adopt, a model like FAIR in maturing your cybersecurity risk management program, this is not an all or not value proposition where you flip a switch and suddenly you implement everything. It is a journey, and into various stages of maturity. And so what we have learned from our members at the FAIR Institute is that this journey has different, stages of accomplishment. And you can unlock, FAIR allows you to unlock with the right processes, the right tooling, different level of capabilities. At the beginning, what most organizations want to do is understand the risk landscape. What are my top risks? And they want to do it quickly. They may resolve of doing, quick and dirty risk analysis to assess the orders of magnitude. And when you have, audit findings, policy exceptions, understand where they stack rank, and prioritize very quickly. And so understanding the lay of the land is typically where organizations and agencies start. Once you do that, once you assess, here's my top risk, how much risk we have, the question that will be asked the risk organization or cyber risk team here will be, what are you doing about it? And this is where we get into, is it our question?
Spotty internet, but I thought it might be better down here. Is it?
Sorry, if you're not asking a question, if you can please mute. So once you understand your top risk, then what you're going to do about it. And this is where we see the next stage of maturity being enabling operational decisions. Going deeper on the assessment that are material to the agency, and now comparing my options, my remediation options, and when necessary, conduct cost-benefit analysis. And again, key decision making. That's where you're going to get the ROI, on investments, and can really start prioritizing. I assume that we heard the basics of the beginning of the slide, where we summarized how organizations can adopt, FAIR And a journey that can take multiple stages, starting with understanding this risk landscape clarity, making operational decisions by assessing what options are most effective and doing cost-benefit analysis. And once that is done, being able to show more strategically how are we trending over time in terms of our risk posture. Are we diminishing risk because we're effective in our program, or are there new threats that are emerging that are increasing risk and then we need to account for? And how is that comparing, this risk posture, to our risk appetite over time? And how are we slicing and dicing risk according to our portfolio by division, department, service, within the agency? And then the ultimate stage is once those risk scenarios are well defined, starting to, in some cases, automate, the data gathering of these analysis, so that maybe changing state of controls can inform automatically, the risk scenario and show you dynamically how risk goes up and down based on new threats or better control. So it is, again, not a flip the switch kind of journey. It is a journey through an increased level of capabilities. Most agencies we've seen start from the first step, but sometimes start from the second because they may have some big investments to make and they need a quick decision support. And so depending on the agency imperatives, the order may not always be sequential. So integrating cyber risk into ERM. So this is important for these programs to be effective. Most effective is that when cyber is not doing this in isolation, where they align with ERM. And so what we're seeing with ERM alignment activities start from just taxonomy alignment, making sure that taxonomy we use speaking about risk across the agency is consistent across cyber and other forms of operational risk. So typically, we see a lot of training being done in analysis on the FAIR model. It is not rare, actually, it's a more frequent occurrence that the FAIR model may be brought in by the cyber team and then expands into operations. We've seen the reverse as well. And in some cases, taxonomy alignment is not the only thing that's happened. In some cases, model validation. In some cases, there is deeper investigation into the math that goes into it. But then once you align yourself, and this happens typically in the first stage of the implementation, in the first year, 6 months, a year or so, this is where the process will get aligned. And the feeding of the results of the analysis in the right risk registers that they be maintained by ERM gets established. And you can start stack ranking of cyber as part of your risk, holistic view of risk within the agency. What and why? What is it that agencies use it for? And so, what are the use cases we see more frequent? And so, here's an illustration of some of the more typical ones. The number one use case, and they tell us, is that the number one thing we want to do is speak a language that everybody else outside of cybersecurity understands. And so being able to articulate loss exposure in financial terms, dollars and cents, allows us then to preserve value as we speak investments, as we make decisions of spending and prioritize, and allow the agency head finance to engage in the decision making versus being a little bit just in arm wrestling mode, for money when we need to spend money. Second use case is it's floating rapidly, to the top, is selecting the best security architecture for digital transformations. A lot of agencies are modernizing their IT systems, and security needs to be part of the fabric. And so what are the architectures that allow us to securely deploy these initiatives? And so this is becoming a really top of mind topic for many agencies. And in this case, it really would help, improve and support the business case and picking up the option that is most cost effective. Third category that we hear often is prioritizing risk mitigation. We just have too much work and not enough time and resources. So we want to focus where it matters the most. And it matters the most being, where there's the biggest risk reduction capabilities. And so versus just relying on our gut on our experience that may not apply in the same way in the new context of the new agency. Next topic is, we hear it more and more, justifying cybersecurity spend. Big initiatives coming in. Here we come again, asking for more money and being able to provide a rationale that makes sense, where we understand, explain the value of the agency to the public, to the government of that investment, and can, in very factual and very explicit terms, make our case. And then meeting regulation, in its case, expectations that are set by FISMA and that are not necessarily, many agencies think are just meeting a bunch of technical requirements. And when we talk to IGs, they tell us, no, listen, if an agency takes a risk-based approach, we believe it's superior, but they need to demonstrate they have a valid model. And we believe that FAIR qualifies as such a model and can get you into a more mature discussion versus just checking boxes. And we are approaching here the end of the base presentation, and by saying that several agencies are already on this journey. Some of them have built, some of them are in the process of building, some of them are considering building programs. These are just a sample agencies that are part of the FAIR, federal government chapter that are collaborating, and so that they don't go it alone. That as they make advances, they share the best practices. It's a very generous group that doesn't want to hoard information, actually wants to share it. I know for a fact that the CISO at Department of Energy, I think he's second in command actually, and the head of cyber risk at NASA have briefed OMB about their practices for the benefit of other CISOs and CIOs. And so the word is starting to spread within cybersecurity circles, but we felt, and I want to thank AFERM for the opportunity to also now expand the discussion to ERM. So the discussion doesn't remain isolated in cyber, but becomes part of the bigger cyber risk and ERM discussion. So ultimately, our goal is to accompany agencies in this journey where they're not just assessing cybersecurity risk, but also more and more privacy risk. It's part of the scope that FAIR covers, and then help in integration and provide this common language, common model that allows this integration between this cyber and ERM. There should really be, one big domain, in cyber being just a subdomain of ERM and not a silo on its own. And with that, I'm gonna put a slide, an informative slide with resources on the screen to give you some pointers to sites where you can find more information about FAIR. Again, membership to the Institute is free. And information about chapters, the federal chapters are very active, opportunities for training, and also to learn more from other practitioners. We have a conference coming up in October. There is a federal government track and actually government-based FAIR training program offered at that conference as well. So with that, I will pause and hope we find a way to field questions onto me.
All right, I am going to ask these questions for you, make it easy. So let's get started. How many federal agencies are currently managing their risk in financial terms?
The ones I am familiar with, I know that 2 agencies are doing it and soon 3, I would say 3 now. And yes, so these are 2 very large agencies. One is a bit smaller agencies. They are actually doing it today. And there's another handful that are in the process of giving it a very strong consideration and starting pilots this year.
Okay.
So it's still, again, a small but recent but very fast developing initiative in the federal government.
All right, let's see.
Is it another question?
Yes, I'm looking through here. Let's see. I have a long one. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Calculating risk exposure isn't always so straightforward. Use an example showing a window 50 to 400,000. It seems like this introduces a level of subjectivity, as you suggest, is true with quantitative risk. If you agree, how do you suggest dealing with this? Would it make more sense to apply money ranges to qualitative levels, like high to really expensive, medium to like moderately, and low to not expensive?
No, it's a very good question. It's actually one that we get in government very, very often. And there is a sense that I'm going to be quicker and it's better to be subjective to high, medium, low. The problem is how much do you invest with a medium and a low? And when you do a comparative analysis, does the new control reduce you to medium, low? And what does it mean? And how does it compare to the investment? It gets very, very difficult to make sense of it very quickly. And so, again, we've seen qualitative being a little bit effective in just providing a map of risk, but when it comes to decision making for action prioritization, much more challenging. What we have seen is that there is a belief that to quantify risk, one, you need a lot of data and you need to have a lot of precision. And we don't subscribe to that. So what our members are telling us is that a few things. One is it's okay to have variance in data. You're never going to have precision, at every time point. And it's okay to use ranges. If you have variance, in a certain situation, and then I use a cyber example, and apologies if it's maybe technical, but if you don't know exactly how well your systems are patched against a certain vulnerability, but you know that you're going to be between 40 to 60% of our servers are patched for that and the others are not, using a range like that is okay. And so you may have a variance in the input, which is going to result in variance in the output, and that's very much okay. Because when you implement the control, what you care about is to see what is the relative movement of the entire bell curve, not necessarily the exact change in most likely figure. It's like, how effective is it? Is it moving me by a few $100,000 or millions of dollars? And how much is another control moving this bell curve in relative terms? So that's one thing that tell us is using ranges and calibrating your estimates is very important. And a little data goes a long way in reducing the uncertainty. So what we're hearing oftentimes is like, the way I explain it is that imagine a continuum between knowing nothing about a certain data point and knowing everything. A little bit of data goes a long way in reducing that uncertainty. So knowing that this event may happen once in 10 years versus once a day, it's already a lot. And I can use that and saying, okay, I have some variance. Maybe I want to use a range. It's once in 5 years to once in 10 years. So that's an acceptable range, okay? It's better than just a high, because if you use a qualitative range and says high or medium frequency, what does a scale really mean, And you may have different definitions of what a high or medium frequency means, depending on who you're asking, and then you get lost in the shades of gray. Might as well go to quantitative right away, knowing that ranges are okay, and a little data can go a long way. You don't need to be super precise. So it's more important to be accurate in ranges, reflect the uncertainty you have, honestly, versus thinking that you have to be naively precise, which will insert a lot of biases in the process, and that you want to avoid. So best practices again in industry, don't go with precise data points, use ranges, and also reflect and explain the uncertainty you have in those numbers and saying, this is the range I use. It's based on this subject matter expert, so provide a rationale for it based on these data points. That makes it much more explicit, much more defensible. So when you provide results of an analysis, you can explain all the assumptions and the rationale in very detailed terms, and then can potentially iterate in ways that if you do a high, medium, low scales, etc., it's much more difficult to do, because usually the rationale is not as deep and not as well documented. And then again, doesn't help you in ultimate decision making. So we need to remove this fallacy that says quantification needs crazy amounts of data. That's not the case. You can use ranges and a high level of measurements. Don't use finite data points, because that level of precision doesn't exist in real life and it's too difficult to achieve. Hopefully I answered the question at least a little bit.
All right. What is the FAIR definition of a privacy breach versus a security breach in the FAIR model? Are you separating cyber versus privacy in risk quantification, analytics, and loss determination?
So here we're talking about semantics, because some companies distinguish between cyber risk, information risk, and privacy and other forms of loss in various categories. So I don't want to get lost in semantics. The way I would define privacy here is loss of confidential information related to certain categories of individual, some type of records. As an example, loss of confidentiality, so a breach that results in loss of confidentiality, so breach of personal PI records, personal information records, maybe emails, maybe addresses, maybe credit card numbers, PCI information, or healthcare information, status of your health. When we talk about privacy risk, we're talking about risk scenarios that apply to loss of confidentiality, and oftentimes directly related to personal information. Everything is under PCI, PI, PHI, etc. It's typically assessing the probable loss exposure related to those kind of scenarios. And while cyber being potentially, in some cases, depending on how an agency defines cyber, could be inclusive of privacy or exclusive. We've seen both. What the new regulations in government and in private sector, I'm thinking, CCAR in California, and thinking GDPR globally based on European regulation. In organization are segmenting, privacy scenarios a bit apart, because you need to report to these regulatory requirements specifically, and not mesh these kind of requirements as part of wider cyber reporting. And so if you have a mature program, you want to segment and separate these scenarios, but then also being able to aggregate to show, your full liability and information risk, and then the full ERM liability. And so I can see the need for segmenting this apart for specific reporting and assessing and management purposes.
How do you factor the efficacy of tokenization into the risk reduction computation? It is not just about having tokenization enforced, but are they actually working and protecting as expected?
Yes. So, there's probably 2 or 3 questions in that question. So it's a very good question. So I'm going to ask first a general statement in terms of how, in a FAIR analysis, you assess the effectiveness of a control. So in FAIR, when you look at a control, it typically can have 3 effects on risk. It can either reduce the frequency, because you may prevent the threat actor to even get in touch with the asset of value. And so some things like a firewall is a good example of that. You reduce the frequency of the threat event. Some systems hardened, the control, make it harder for a threat actor to access it. And some other controls reduce the footprint you can access to, And in the case of what we have seen in some analysis based on work from analysts, in terms of encryption, it makes it much harder for certain categories of threat actors to access some controls. And I want to use absolutes here, because it depends who the threat actor are. In FAIR, you need to compare capability of threat actor with the strength of a control, because if the state actor is, a nation state, maybe, China, pick up something I'm reading in the newspaper these days. They may have capabilities to break certain level of encryption that an agency may decide to use. And so doing an analysis, knowing what a threat actor is very important, because in one case, I can completely block the attacker, because I'm blocking cyber criminals from accessing the data. It becomes much more difficult, and so I'm very effective there. But if it's a nation state, maybe it only buys me some time, and they can ultimately break it, and I need to consider a different level of encryption. So one, again, in summary, understand what factor this control influences in terms of control. Second is put it in context of the threat actor. It's always in context of the threat actor. The control is not an absolute. It's always effective in context of the threat actor. So when you announce it, you got to factor all of that in.
Right. That looks like the conclusion of any of the technical questions. I am getting several questions about whether the recording will be available after this. It will be, and we'll have nice cleaned up audios that anyone having trouble today, as well as that point where we lost some audio, will be removed. So just look out for an email from AFERM with a link to that. And that's all I have, Nick.
Well, I hope that the audience found this informative and that it leads to an inspiration for elevating, your ambition in terms of leading your cyber risk teams to better decision making, to more cost-effective decisions, better implementation of cybersecurity programs, and programs that work hand in hand with ERM and speak the same language. For the better protection of and better fulfillment of the mission, the agency's mission. So with that, I thank AFERM for the opportunity again to speak to you and look forward to continuing discussion.